Walter Reed pushed open the diner's glass door just as a soft winter breeze caught the back of his long olive-drab coat. The bell above chimed faintly, announcing his quiet arrival. Inside, the warmth hit him almost instantly, the kind of cozy, lived-in warmth only found in places like this, where coffee is poured without fuss and the scent of bacon clings to the walls like history. He paused at the entrance for just a second, surveying the room the way a soldier might scan a perimeter, not out of fear, but habit. The diner was mostly empty, just a few early risers sipping from thick ceramic mugs, their gazes low and tired. A waitress leaned lazily against the counter, flipping through a folded newspaper with smudged ink. She didn't smile when she looked up at him, didn't frown either, just nodded. Walter returned the nod, polite, restrained, the kind of gesture a black man of his generation had learned to master. He moved toward a corner booth by the window, his boots thudding softly on the linoleum floor that had seen better decades. His hands, gloved and weathered, slid across the table as he sat down, placing them palms down like someone settling into a ritual. He exhaled deeply and checked his watch. 8:05 a.m. Danielle was late, but that was okay. Walter had always been good at waiting. Waiting was a skill he'd sharpened during the war, long nights in freezing camps, eyes peeled toward the horizon, waiting on orders, waiting on peace, waiting on letters that didn't always come. After the war, he waited again, waited to be seen, waited to be treated like he mattered in a country he nearly died for. So no, waiting didn't bother him. He unbuttoned the top of his coat, revealing the thick sweater beneath, worn thin at the elbows but warm all the same. With slow, practiced fingers, he removed his gloves and placed them neatly beside him, then folded his hands over the table and let his eyes wander. A simple space, chrome-trimmed bar stools, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a song in years, and a faded black and white photo of the town's founders on the wall. Not a single black face among them. He could feel them, the glances. Not stares, not yet, just flickers. Quick looks from the older couple 2 booths down. A subtle narrowing of the eyes from the man at the counter. The kind of silent suspicion that didn't need words. Walter had lived through enough decades to know what it meant. You don't belong here. But he did. He absolutely did. He signaled to the waitress, who walked over with the tired steps of someone halfway through a long shift. Just coffee, please, Walter said, offering a gentle smile. She nodded without saying a word and returned moments later with a steaming mug. No cream, no sugar, just black, how he liked it. He wrapped both hands around it and held it for a while before taking a sip. The warmth traveled through him, slow and steady, anchoring him. Coffee had become a ritual of his, something small, dependable, something that felt like home no matter where he was. Outside the window, he watched as a light snow began to fall, the flakes drifting down like time itself, silent and indifferent. He remembered other winters, ones harsher than this, the kind spent in a muddy foxhole with nothing but his rifle and prayers. And now, decades later, here he was, just a man in a booth in a quiet town, waiting for his daughter. Walter smiled faintly at the thought of Danielle, his girl. A sharp mind, a fierce protector. Captain Danielle Reed of the city's police department. She had earned everything, not just her title but her respect. Walter had raised her to stand tall without stepping on others, to lead with integrity, not intimidation. Walter had come to town at Danielle's request. They hadn't had breakfast together in a while, and today felt like a good day to change that. They planned to meet here, halfway between Danielle's precinct and Walter's modest home outside the city. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Another glance at his watch, 8:12. Still no Danielle, still fine. He took another sip. The diner was growing quieter now, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the scrape of silverware against plates. No music, no conversation, just quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around you if you let it. Walter didn't mind. Silence was easier than explaining himself to people who never really wanted to listen. He looked down at his coffee and caught a glimpse of his reflection in the dark surface. Tired eyes, a strong jaw softened by time, a scar just beneath his chin from a grenade that hadn't exploded the way it was supposed to. That scar had earned him a medal. The coffee shop wouldn't know that. The man at the counter wouldn't care. The waitress wouldn't ask. To them, he was just an old black man in a place where folks like him didn't usually linger. A shadow in a booth, not a story, not a person. Walter sighed and leaned back, letting the warmth of the mug settle in his chest like a shield. He didn't need their approval. He had already earned his place in this world with sweat, blood, and dignity. He didn't know in that moment that a storm was already walking through the door, that a woman in uniform with a badge and bitterness on her breath was about to try and erase him. Her name was Officer Patricia Williams, and she didn't know, not yet, that the man she was about to harass was the father of her commanding officer. The door swung open with a sharp chime, jolting Walter slightly from his thoughts. Cold air rushed into the warm diner like a slap, followed by the heavy click of polished boots on linoleum. Officer Patricia Williams stepped inside, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. She wore her authority like armor, neatly pressed uniform, spotless badge, and a purposeful skull. Her eyes swept across the diner like searchlights, scanning, calculating, the kind of gaze meant to unsettle. Walter didn't move. He didn't have to. But Patricia's eyes landed on him and lingered. Something shifted in her stance, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in her jaw. Her boots began to move again, each step echoing louder than the last as she approached his booth. "You lost, sir?" she asked, not kindly, not curious. Her tone had a blade's edge. Walter looked up slowly, calmly. "Just waiting for my daughter," he said, meeting her gaze. Patricia crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly as if measuring his worth with her eyes. "Your daughter, huh? A lot of folks don't come to this side of town unless they got a reason. Especially strangers." He didn't blink. "I've got my reason." Silence followed. A slow, stretching silence where her presence pulled all the air out of the room. The waitress had retreated behind the counter. Even the clinking of coffee mugs had stopped. Patricia let the silence hang, watching Walter the way a lion sizes up prey. Then she stepped in closer. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Walter's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in the quiet, simmering way of a man who has been through this too many times. He reached into his coat slowly, carefully, the way a black man learns to move when under scrutiny. From his inside pocket, he pulled out a well-worn leather wallet. Inside it, a laminated veteran's ID, its edges frayed, the photo faded but proud. He handed it to her. Patricia barely looked at it. "Veteran, huh?" she said with a smirk. "Doesn't mean you belong here." She tossed the ID back onto the table. It spun slightly before settling. Walter let out a slow breath. "I served this country. I have every right to sit here and drink my coffee." Patricia's nostrils flared. "People around here don't feel safe when someone's loitering, especially someone who looks like they might be hiding something." "And what exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked, voice calm but low and steady. Patricia didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward, both hands pressing against the edge of his table. "I'm giving you a chance to leave peacefully, sir. Let's not escalate things." Walter stared at her, unmoving. "I'm not leaving until my daughter gets here." Patricia's smile was thin, humorless. "Suit yourself." She straightened, then looked over her shoulder at the few patrons who were now pretending not to eavesdrop. "You all okay over here?" she asked loudly, as if Walter's mere presence constituted a threat. One man nodded nervously. Another woman looked away. Patricia turned back, now with a fresh wave of superiority washing over her face. "I've had enough," she muttered, reaching down to grab his elbow. Walter recoiled just slightly, not from fear, but from the violation. "Get your hand off me." She didn't listen. With a swift, practiced motion, she yanked him up from the booth. His coffee cup tumbled over, spilling across the table and onto the floor. The room gasped. "Turn around," she ordered, reaching for her handcuffs. "Officer, you're resisting now." "I'm not resisting. I'm waiting for my daughter." Last warning. Walter stood still, his chest rising slowly. "You have no cause to arrest me." Patricia snarled. "You want cause. You're causing a disturbance. You're refusing a lawful order. You're intimidating patrons." "I said nothing. I've done nothing." Patricia snapped the cuffs on too tight. She marched him through the diner like a criminal, her grip tight on his shoulder. The snow was falling heavier now, sticking to the brim of his cap and his eyebrows as she forced him toward the cruiser. His boots dragged slightly, not from resistance, but from the weight of disbelief. He didn't look back. He didn't want them to see the humiliation. At the station, the air was sterile and unforgiving. The fluorescent lights flickered. The booking officer blinked when he saw who Patricia was bringing in. Officer Williams, what's the charge?" "Disturbing the peace, resisting, possible false ID." Processed, fingerprinted, and pushed into a holding cell. The bars clanged shut. Cold bench, bare walls, a silence more brutal than anything he felt at the diner. He sat and waited. Again. The door burst open an hour later. The sound of polish. The officer looked at Walter, then back at Patricia. He's like 70. Patricia said nothing. Walter waited. Shoes, fast and heavy. Voices. A shout. "Where is he?" Patricia looked up from her desk. Her blood ran cold. Captain Danielle Reed stormed down the hallway like a force of nature, her badge flashing under her coat, eyes like fire. "Where is my father?" Patricia stood slowly. "Ma'am, I didn't know he was." "Spare me," Danielle snapped. "Where is he?" Patricia motioned silently. Danielle stormed past her. Walter stood as the door opened, father and daughter's eyes meeting. "I'm sorry I'm late," Danielle whispered, pain in her voice. "You're just in time," Walter replied. She turned to Patricia, voice low but cutting. "You're done." Danielle didn't wait for backup. She didn't pause for explanations or decorum. Her steps echoed down the hallway like thunder, and every officer within earshot knew something serious had just erupted. The holding cell door creaked open under her command. Walter stood slowly, a calm look on his face despite the cuffs. Danielle rushed to him, her jaw tight, eyes flickering with barely suppressed fury. "Are you okay?" she asked. Walter gave a small nod. "I've been through worse." But that was something. Danielle reached for the key on the guard's belt without asking and unlocked the cuffs herself, her hands shaking as she helped her father out of the cell. She turned toward the officers watching from behind the desk. "Get me internal affairs," she said through clenched teeth. Now. By late afternoon, the review had been scheduled. Danielle sat at the head of the long oak table in the department's meeting room, flanked by two senior officers, a civilian oversight representative and the IA officer, Lieutenant Roselles. At the far end, stiff and visibly tense, sat Officer Patricia Williams. Her crisp uniform didn't hide the sweat forming along her brow. The room was silent as Roselles opened the file. Today's hearing concerns Officer Patricia Williams and her treatment of Mr. Walter Reed, a decorated veteran, and the father of Captain Danielle Reed. Patricia shifted in her chair. "If I may, I'd like to say I was unaware of the man's identity when—" "You will have your time to speak," Roselles interrupted, not unkindly. "For now, we will review the incident step by step. Captain Reed, please begin." Danielle's voice was steady, though the fire hadn't left her tone. "Walter Reed was seated in a diner waiting for me. He wasn't causing any disturbance. Multiple eyewitness accounts confirm he was quiet, respectful, and simply having a cup of coffee. Roselle's nodded. And what initiated the confrontation? Daniel's eyes moved to Patricia. Officer Williams entered the diner, singled out my father, demanded ID, dismissed his veteran status, and escalated the situation to the point of unnecessary arrest. Patricia's voice cracked slightly. It wasn't personal. I didn't recognize him. He looked unfamiliar in that setting. I had received complaints in the past about loitering. And you received no complaint that morning, Danielle interrupted. We checked the dispatch logs. There was no call, no alert. You took it upon yourself to harass a senior black man sitting alone. Patricia's jaw clenched. He refused to leave when asked. Because he had no reason to leave, Danielle's voice rose. Because he was waiting for his daughter, me. Because he had done nothing wrong. Roselle's raised a hand. Let's proceed in order. Officer Williams, did you physically remove Mr. Reed from the diner? Patricia nodded. Yes. Did he resist arrest? She hesitated. Not violently. He didn't comply right away. That is not resistance, Roselle's replied. Was he threatening? Verbally aggressive? No. Did he pose a danger to others? Patricia said nothing. Roselle's continued. Did you use excessive force? Patricia shifted. I followed protocol. Danielle leaned forward. You humiliated a veteran. You handcuffed a 74-year-old man who posed no threat. You dragged him through snow in front of diners who had said nothing, and you threw him in a cell like he was trash. I didn't know who he was, Patricia replied, more defensively now. I thought he might be lying. Danielle's voice dropped. Would you have thought that if he were white? The room froze. Patricia's eyes darted toward the civilian rep, then Roselle's. I don't see race in the line of duty. Roselle's looked up slowly. That, Officer Williams, may be the most dangerous lie of all. As the hearing continued, more evidence was presented. Security camera footage from the diner showing Walter sitting quietly and being approached by Patricia. Testimonies from the waitress and 2 patrons corroborating his calm demeanor. The footage showed the spilled coffee, the cuffs, the tension. Patricia sat silently now, her shoulders sinking with each new piece of evidence. Finally, Roselle's closed the file. Before we deliberate, does anyone wish to speak on Officer Williams' behalf? Silence. No one moved, not even her former training partner seated near the back. Roselle's turned to Patricia. You may give a final statement. Patricia stood, her voice low. I made a mistake. I misread the situation. I let my bias, conscious or not, cloud my judgment. I didn't intend to disrespect anyone, and certainly not a veteran. Danielle tilted her head. But you did, and intention doesn't undo harm. Patricia looked down. I understand. Roselle's spoke with the weight of authority. This department cannot and will not tolerate abuse of power, racial profiling, or unnecessary escalation. Officer Williams, effective immediately, you are relieved of duty. Your badge and weapon are to be surrendered by end of day. Patricia's hands twitched. Her lips parted as if to argue, but nothing came. She nodded slowly, numb. You may leave the room, Roselle said. Patricia stood and walked out without a word. The silence she left behind was heavier than her presence. Later that evening, Danielle drove to her father's house. Walter was on the porch, a mug of tea in his hands, the steam rising against the early evening air. She sat beside him without speaking. For a while, they just watched the sky. Finally, she said, She's gone. Dismissed. Walter nodded. Justice. Something like it, she replied. He took a sip of tea. It's not the first time someone's tried to make me small. Danielle turned to him. You didn't look small to me. He smiled faintly. That's because you were watching. That made all the difference. She placed a hand on his. We keep fighting, she whispered. Walter nodded. Always. Word of the incident didn't stay confined to the station walls. By the next morning, the diner incident was the lead headline on local news. Veteran wrongfully arrested in local diner. Officer dismissed after review. A photo of Walter Reed, back straight, eyes resolute, sitting in that corner booth, circulated quickly, first through town, then online. And with it came questions. Why was he arrested? Why was he disrespected? And most importantly, how often does this happen to those who don't have a daughter wearing a badge? Outside the diner, a small crowd had gathered by noon. Some held signs: "Respect veterans," "Black Lives Matter," "Dignity has no color." A local reverend spoke through a megaphone, his voice thick with grief and pride. "Mr. Reed served this country, and it's time this country starts serving people like him. Not just when it's convenient, not just when they wear a uniform." The owner of the diner, an older woman named Helen, came out during the demonstration and apologized to Walter personally. She shook his hand with trembling fingers and tears in her eyes. "I should have said something. I was scared, but that's no excuse. You didn't deserve that." Walter, ever composed, simply nodded. "The important thing is you see it now." In the days that followed, news vans lined the street outside the police department. Reporters pressed Danielle for statements. Every public appearance brought scrutiny. Every silence became a headline. In one televised interview, she sat beside her father, her posture proud. "We cannot continue to act like these incidents are outliers," she said clearly. "This was not the first time a man like my father was treated as a threat for doing absolutely nothing. But it needs to be the last," Walter added. "I don't want pity. I want progress. And that starts with accountability, not just for one officer, but for every system that allowed her behavior to feel acceptable." Meanwhile, inside the department, tensions were rising. Some officers whispered behind closed doors. Others voiced support for Danielle openly, telling her they respected what she did, what she stood for. But there were others, quieter, colder, who avoided eye contact in the halls, who responded to orders with clipped tones. Danielle didn't care, not now. She had learned from her father that standing alone wasn't weakness, it was principle. But the weight of leadership was heavy. After a particularly long day, she found herself walking to the same diner. Helen greeted her softly and pointed to the booth. "He's already here." Sure enough, Walter sat in the same spot, coffee in hand. The room was quieter this time, but not silent. There were nods from strangers, a few smiles. A young black boy stared at Walter like he was a superhero. Danielle slid into the booth. Walter smiled. "You look tired." "Comes with the territory." They drank their coffee in silence for a while. "You think it'll change anything?" she asked finally. Walter took a long sip. "I think it changed you." She blinked. "Me?" "You're more certain now. Fiercer. The kind of leader who doesn't ask permission to do the right thing." Danielle didn't respond right away. She watched the boy across the room, still peeking their way. "That kid's watching you like your magic." Walter chuckled. "Then I'd better not disappoint him." The following week, a town hall was held. It was tense. Black residents shared stories they had never said out loud. Microaggressions, traffic stops that turned into interrogations, being followed in stores, being told to leave restaurants. Always polite, always patient, but always watched. One older man stood up. "I remember when I came back from Vietnam, and they told me I couldn't sit in a restaurant I had walked past for years. I wore the uniform, same as them, but all they saw was my skin." A young mother followed. "I worry every time my son leaves the house. I shouldn't have to feel that way, but I do." And then Walter stood. The room quieted. "I was taught to believe in something bigger than myself, so I served. I followed orders. I risked my life. But when I came back, I learned that the real war wasn't overseas, it was here. Every time I walk into a store and get followed. Every time I sit in a diner and get asked if I'm lost. Every time someone questions whether I belong. That's the war that never ends. He paused. But I'm not bitter. I'm resolved. Because I see all of you. I see your pain, your strength. And I know we can do better, not just punish one person, but change everything around them that made them feel they could get away with it. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long sustained, heavy with meaning. A month later, the department implemented new anti-bias training, overseen directly by Danielle. It wasn't perfect. Change never was, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, people believed their voices had moved the system. Walter kept going to the diner, sometimes with Danielle, sometimes alone. Sometimes someone would walk up just to say thank you, and he would always nod and say the same thing. Don't thank me. Just keep standing. The ripples spread farther than anyone had expected. Within days, national news outlets picked up the story. Clips of Walter's town hall speech circulated widely on social media. Hashtags trended. Hashtag stand with Walter. Hashtag respect our veterans. Hashtag justice beyond the badge. Civil rights organizations began reaching out. Commentators debated on morning shows. Talk radio buzzed with call-ins, some outraged, others defensive, all impassioned. For the first time in years, the country wasn't just talking about racism in abstract terms. They were talking about Walter Reed, a quiet man, a veteran, who'd asked for nothing but coffee and dignity. Danielle was invited to Washington to speak before a congressional subcommittee on police reform. She almost didn't go. I'm not a politician, she told her father the night before. I'm a cop. I deal in actions, not speeches. Walter looked at her calm and steady. Then speak like a cop. Tell them what it looks like from the inside. So she went. In a modest gray suit, no frills, Danielle stood before the microphone and told the story, not just of what happened to her father, but of what had been happening to people like him for decades. She spoke about bias training, accountability, institutional culture, about silence and complicity, about the difference between a uniform worn with honor and one used as a shield. The room was quiet as she spoke. When she finished, several members stood and applauded. Others just nodded solemnly. But for once, they were listening. Back in town, Walter tried to stay out of the spotlight. The diner had become something of a symbol now. People traveled from neighboring cities just to sit at his booth. Helen, the owner, started donating part of the diner's proceeds to veteran outreach and anti-racism training. A mural went up on the brick wall behind the diner, a painted image of Walter sitting tall in his booth with the words "Dignity doesn't ask permission." Walter was there the morning they finished it. A group of local artists, black and white and brown, had painted through the night. When he saw it, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally he said, "I never wanted to be the center of this. But if my silence would have made someone else feel small, then I'm proud I spoke." Officer Patricia Williams, meanwhile, disappeared from the public eye. But she didn't vanish completely. 6 months after the incident, Danielle received a letter. No return address, just her name in neat, deliberate handwriting. Inside, a short note. "I've been through the training. Real training this time. I've had time to sit with what I did. I didn't just misjudge a man. I misjudged myself. You don't have to respond. I just wanted to say I see it now. And I'm sorry." Danielle didn't show the letter to anyone for days. Then one quiet evening, she handed it to her father. He read it slowly, then folded it. "She's not asking for forgiveness," he said. "She's asking for the weight to be a little lighter." "Do you think people can really change?" Danielle asked. Walter looked up at the sky. "If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be here." National attention brought pressure. Other departments began to audit their own practices. Some pushed back loudly, others leaned in. Danielle found herself consulting with departments across the country, not as a symbol, but as a strategist. She helped build policy around officer-community relations, around internal reporting systems, around meaningful reform. The work was exhausting, but Danielle carried it the way her father carried his silence, with dignity. Walter joined her at events from time to time. He didn't like speaking much, but when he did, people listened. His quiet strength was louder than most microphones. At one event, a young black officer approached him after the panel. "Mr. Reed, sir, my dad served too, but he told me to stay out of law enforcement. Said it wasn't built for us." Walter looked the young man in the eye. "He's not wrong, but maybe that's why you're needed." Time passed. Seasons changed. The story faded from the headlines, as stories do. But something had shifted in their town, and in many others. New cadets were trained not just on protocol but on presence, on empathy, on listening, on when not to act. Departments began pairing with community liaisons. Officers walked neighborhoods, not just patrolled them. It wasn't perfect. It was far from over. But it was something. Walter kept going to the diner. He'd sit in that same booth, sip his coffee slowly, and nod to the people who recognized him. Sometimes they said thank you. Sometimes they just offered a look that said, "I see you." And that was enough. Danielle kept rising, not just through the ranks, but in influence. Her name was spoken in rooms where policies were shaped, where reform became law. But her favorite place remained across from her father, hands wrapped around a warm mug, in the booth where it all began. One morning, she asked him, "If you could go back, would you change anything?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "If I hadn't been there, maybe someone else would have. Someone younger, someone who didn't know how to hold their temper. Maybe the ending would have been different." Danielle nodded, her eyes misting. "But we're still writing it," he smiled. "That we are." A year had passed since the morning Walter Reed sat alone in the diner, waiting for his daughter. 1 year since a single cup of coffee turned into a national conversation. Yet to Walter, much of life felt the same. The mornings were still quiet, the coffee still strong. The wind still bit at his neck when he walked to the diner, caught her up, hands in the same olive drab coat he wore that day. But the eyes had changed. People didn't look through him anymore. They looked at him, some with gratitude, some with guilt, but most with recognition, as if they finally understood that beneath the coat and worn shoes stood a man who had always deserved to be seen. Inside the diner, his booth had become almost sacred. It wasn't reserved, but no one ever sat there. Helen said she didn't need a sign. People just knew. That morning, Walter found a small card waiting on the table, just his name in careful cursive. Inside was a message. "Thank you for showing me how to hold my ground without losing my soul." A mother, a teacher, a witness. He closed the card slowly, holding it for a moment like a fragile memory. Then he tucked it into his coat pocket and nodded at Helen behind the counter. She smiled wordlessly, handing him his usual. Danielle now served as Deputy Director of Community Safety for the state. She still wore her badge when needed, but her reach had grown beyond a single department. She helped reimagine what policing could look like, rooted in equity, guided by empathy, and held accountable to the people it served. When she spoke at leadership academies, she didn't tell her father's story first. She told her own, about the moment she walked into the precinct and found him behind bars, about how the shame, rage, and helplessness in that moment clarified everything. It wasn't about saving my father, she'd tell young officers. It was about saving the version of myself who thought silence was safer than justice. Then she'd tell them about Walter and what dignity looked like in real time. That fall, the town hosted its first Community Day of Reflection, organized by a coalition of teachers, artists, veterans, and youth advocates. The event was held in the town square. There were panels, music, spoken word, and an open mic for anyone to share their story. Walter was asked to speak. He declined at first. "I said what I needed to," he told Danielle. "But they need to hear it again," she replied. "They need to see that dignity doesn't retire." So he stood at the podium that October morning, hands steady on either side, voice low but unwavering. I came here to wait for my daughter, he began, pausing to let the silence settle. And I ended up reminding this town what waiting means. It means you believe something better is coming, even when it's slow, even when you've been told your whole life not to expect it. He looked over the crowd, students, elders, officers in uniform, children sitting cross-legged near the front. I didn't ask to become a symbol. But if my story helped someone else speak up, then I'll carry that with pride. Not because I'm special, but because silence is heavy, and none of us should carry it alone. There were tears, applause, a moment of shared breath held between past and future. Later that evening, Walter and Danielle walked home together. The air was crisp, the streets quiet. A few porch lights glowed softly, and from somewhere nearby came the sound of a child laughing. Danielle slipped her arm through her father's. "Do you think it's working?" she asked. "The change?" Walter was quiet a moment. "It doesn't look like fire. It looks like this, small lights in quiet places, people choosing to do better when they don't have to." Danielle nodded, taking in the meaning. "You know," he added, "there was a time I thought I'd leave this world invisible. That I'd be a name in a file, a folded flag in a drawer." "You're more than seen now," Danielle said softly. He looked at her, eyes glinting with something close to peace. "That's because you made them look." A week later, a high school student named Marcus Johnson stood in front of his civics class. He was presenting on local heroes. His teacher expected a PowerPoint. Marcus brought a story. He told the class about a veteran who sat in a booth and waited for coffee, about how the world tried to push him out of the frame, but how he stayed. How his daughter didn't just speak up for him, but changed the way justice looked in their state. And that's why, Marcus concluded, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear old army coats and carry quiet courage. Back at the diner, Helen added something to the mural. A second figure opposite Walter's, reaching across the table. A hand. A badge. A daughter. The words underneath now read, "Dignity doesn't ask permission. It stands. It waits. It leads." And beneath that, in smaller text, "For every voice that refused to be silenced." The quiet revolution hadn't ended. It had only just begun. And in the corner booth by the window, the man who taught the world how to wait was still there, still sipping, still seen. Winter came quietly. Snow blanketed the streets in soft silence, and the diner's windows fogged with the breath of warm conversation and hot coffee. Walter still came every morning. Helen would always have his table ready, his coffee poured, and a quiet smile waiting. But something in Walter had begun to slow, not his pride, not his presence, but his body. His steps took more effort now. His hands ached a little longer each morning, and his gaze lingered more at the window than on the coffee in his cup. Danielle noticed. She didn't speak of it often, but she was always watching, checking, helping in subtle ways, carrying bags before he asked, adjusting the thermostat without making it obvious. She knew her father too well to treat him like he was fragile, but she also knew that time, like dignity, moves quietly and with weight. One morning, Walter didn't show up at the diner. Helen called Danielle by noon. "He's never missed a day," Helen said, concern barely contained. "Not even in the blizzard." Danielle was already grabbing her coat. When she arrived, Walter was sitting in his living room, awake, alert, just still. A photo album was open on his lap. "I didn't feel like coffee today," he said before she could ask. "I felt like remembering." She sat beside him. The album held black and white photos from his service, his wedding, the birth of Danielle, a timeline of resilience. "I'm not done," he said softly, "just slowing down." He looked at her. "That okay?" Danielle smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's more than okay." Later that week, a university invited Danielle to deliver the keynote speech at their annual Social Justice Symposium. She agreed but asked if they could do something special, not just a lecture but a dialogue. She wanted Walter there. It took some convincing, but eventually he agreed. If I start coughing, you take over, he warned with a wry smile. They sat together on stage in matching chairs, the spotlight soft and warm. The auditorium was full. Students, professors, activists, officers. Danielle began. We're not here to repeat the same speeches. We're here to remind ourselves that change only sticks if it roots in story, in people. This man beside me, he taught me that. Not with lectures, but with quiet presence, with courage that doesn't shout. Walter leaned toward the mic. I didn't do anything special, he said simply. I just refused to move. A ripple of emotion moved through the room. Danielle continued. When I saw my father in that cell, I realized something. I wasn't angry just because he was my father. I was angry because I saw the truth, that our systems fail not from accident, but from permission. Permission to look away. Permission to escalate. Permission to dehumanize. Walter nodded. And dignity asks for none of that. It just waits. It holds its ground. It reminds people what it looks like to be whole. The crowd stood in a wave of applause, not for drama, but for reverence. Weeks later, Walter fell ill. Not suddenly, not tragically, just slowly. A body that had carried generations of weight was beginning to rest. He was surrounded always by people who loved him. Danielle never left his side. Nurses called him Sir and saluted without irony. Visitors came not to mourn but to honor. He didn't want to fuss. I'm not a monument, he said once. I'm just a man who drank a lot of coffee and kept his mouth shut until it mattered. But Danielle was already writing his eulogy, not for his death, but for his living. She turned it into a piece for the paper, then a talk for young officers. It was titled The Booth by the Window, Lessons from My Father. The day Walter passed was gentle. Danielle was there, holding his hand. He looked at her one last time and whispered, "Don't let the light go out." She didn't cry until later. Not in that moment. In that moment, she simply said, "Never." The town held a memorial at the diner. Not in a church, not in a hall. At the place where the revolution began. They unveiled a brass plaque beneath the mural. Walter Reed, veteran, father, citizen. He'd waited for coffee. He waited for justice. He waited for us to catch up. We're still trying, and we will not stop. Years later, the booth still sat by the window. New faces filled the diner. The town had changed, grown, but the mural never faded, and neither did the memory. Every now and then, a young officer or student would sit in that booth, not to eat, but to think, to feel the weight of quiet strength. And Danielle? She still returned, not every day, but often. She would sit, order her father's coffee, and whisper into the empty seat across from her, "I'm still making them look, Dad. I'm still standing." It had been 5 years since Walter Reed passed. The diner still stood, though the surrounding block had seen change. New businesses, a renovated sidewalk, a mural trail that led from the square to the edge of the park. But the heart of the town remained in that corner booth. Danielle, now the state's commissioner for equity and justice, returned less frequently. Her work took her to cities and communities far from home. But every year, on the anniversary of Walter's passing, she came back to the booth. This year, she didn't come alone. A young man named Elijah followed her through the diner's door. He was quiet, sharp-eyed, and clearly trying to hide the awe on his face. "You sure he won't mind?" he asked, gesturing toward the booth. Danielle smiled. He'd insist. They sat across from each other. Helen, older now, slower on her feet, still poured the coffee herself. She set down 2 mugs, offered a small nod to Danielle, and moved on without a word. "I still can't believe I'm here," Elijah whispered. "You're not here to be impressed," Danielle said gently. "You're here to understand." Elijah had been part of a youth justice program Danielle launched. At 17, he'd nearly been pushed out of the school system after an unjust suspension. But someone had intervened, someone who believed he was worth more than a headline. Now he was 19, And this moment, this booth, was part of his own education. Danielle reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. I was saving this for someone who needed it. Inside was a copy of her father's original statement to the review board. The one that had never been spoken aloud, just written by hand. It had been found in one of Walter's drawers months after his passing. Danielle had preserved it in clear film. Elijah read the note slowly. Dignity does not bend to the room. It fills it, quietly, unshaken. Even when the door is locked and the hands are cuffed. Even then, when he looked up, his eyes shimmered. He really wrote this. Danielle nodded and lived it. Elijah took a deep breath. I want to be like that. Danielle leaned forward. Then you start here, in this booth. But you carry it with you wherever you go. Later that evening, the town held a lantern walk in Walter's memory. Hundreds gathered at the square, each holding a small light. Danielle gave a brief speech, not long, just enough to remind them why they stood together. He wasn't famous. He wasn't loud. But he changed everything because he knew that standing still with purpose can sometimes be the bravest act of all. The crowd began to move slowly down the main street, the lanterns flickering like fireflies in the dusk. Elijah walked near the front, holding his light high. Behind him, Danielle watched the glow reflect on the faces of children, parents, teachers, and strangers. This wasn't just about a man anymore. It was about what he left behind. Not a statue, not a law, but a generation learning how to stand, and a booth by the window, always waiting. Elijah stood in front of the city council for the first time in his life, a folder in one hand, a tight knot in his chest. He wasn't there as a defendant or a protester or even a student. He was there as a voice. My name is Elijah Thomas, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. And I'm here on behalf of the Youth Justice Initiative. Across the room, Danielle sat in the back row, hands folded, pride glowing in her eyes. Elijah continued. We've created a proposal that will partner community mentors with at-risk students, starting in middle school. Not after they've been suspended, not after they've been labeled, but early, before the system gets a say in who they become. He held up the folder. Inside were letters from students, data from teachers, testimonies from parents, stories like his own, except many didn't have a Danielle read to step in. The council murmured. The mayor leaned forward. Elijah had their attention. He told them about the booth, about Walter, about how one act of stillness had stirred a city and a boy who never imagined he'd become a speaker, a leader, a light. We can't wait for the next tragedy to start caring, Elijah said. Let's build something before the fire starts. By the end of his speech, the room was silent. Then applause rose, not polite, but real, grounded, earned. Weeks passed. The program was approved unanimously. It didn't happen overnight, but it began. And Elijah, barely 20, found himself on panels, in classrooms, in courtrooms, not as a defendant, but as a teacher. He spoke softly, but he carried weight. Students listened. Adults listened. He wore his quiet like armor. One afternoon, Danielle invited him back to the diner. Got something for you, she said, handing him a weathered envelope. Inside was a small card from Walter's memorial. On the back, in Danielle's handwriting. You stood just like he did. Keep standing. They're watching now. Elijah tucked it into his wallet. That spring, Elijah returned to his old high school, the one that nearly expelled him. He sat on a panel for senior students along with Danielle and 2 other justice advocates. A teacher introduced him, voice faltering slightly. Elijah Thomas, alumnus, youth leader, and founder of the Groundwork Project. Students who remembered his younger self looked shocked, but Elijah just smiled and walked the mic. 5 years ago, he said, I was suspended for defending myself against a lie. I thought my future ended that day, but someone told me I mattered, that my anger was sacred, that my silence could become power. He looked around the room. You don't have to shout to be strong. You just have to stand. Behind him, Daniel's eyes filled, not just with pride but recognition. The legacy had taken root, not in stone, but in fire. And Elijah carried it forward, one quiet step at a time. Years passed, and the echoes of Walter Reed's quiet resistance never stopped. His name was spoken in classrooms, whispered on street corners, invoked in meetings where policy was shaped. But more than that, it lived in the choices of those who stood in his memory. Elijah Thomas had grown into a young man with a voice forged in stillness and sharpened by fire. He now led a statewide youth coalition. His groundwork project had expanded into over a dozen cities, connecting mentors with thousands of students. But on the 10th anniversary of the diner incident, Elijah found himself returning home. He didn't arrive with a crowd. No reporters, no speeches, just him, a backpack, and a worn copy of Walter's collected writings. The ones Daniel had published as a small, limited edition print called The Booth and Beyond. The diner hadn't changed much. Helen had retired, but the place still smelled of toast and memory. A young server, barely out of high school, greeted him warmly. "You must be Elijah," she said. "Danielle said you might come." He smiled. "Is the booth open?" She nodded and handed him a mug without asking. "Always." Elijah slid into the booth by the window. The sunlight hit just right. He took out the book and set it on the table, gently flipping to the first page. The dedication still struck him. To those who wait, not because they're afraid to act, but because they know when to. Across the diner, a group of students from the local high school sat at a corner table. They whispered and glanced toward him. One of them, a black girl with thick curls and quiet confidence, walked over. "Are you the Elijah Thomas?" she asked. He looked up and chuckled. "Depends who's asking. My name's Naomi. I'm part of the Youth Voices Club. We read your essays and Walter's. They changed how we see everything." Elijah motioned to the seat across from him. "Want to sit?" Naomi nodded, sliding in slowly, reverently. "I've never sat in this booth before," she said. Elijah looked around. "Neither had I, when I was your age. But I learned something here. You don't have to be loud to lead. You just have to be willing to be seen." Naomi opened her backpack and pulled out a notebook. "Would it be okay if I read you something?" He nodded. She began to read. A letter to her future self about dignity, about fear, about standing in small places until the world catches up. Her voice wavered at first, then grew strong, clear, full of something real. When she finished, Elijah clapped softly. "That's powerful." Naomi smiled, shy and radiant. "Thank you for everything you've built." Elijah looked out the window where the mural still stood, Walter with his quiet gaze, Daniel's hand reaching across the table, the words beneath, "Dignity doesn't ask permission." He turned back to Naomi. "I didn't build it alone, and it's not finished. It's yours now too." As the sun dipped lower, the booth felt full again, not just with people, but with purpose. In that simple diner where one man once waited for his daughter, a legacy had taken root in hearts that would carry it forward. And somewhere in the space between silence and story, Walter Reed was still there, still waiting, still seen, still standing.